Okay, I think we're about ready to go. Hopefully, everything is working. So this lecture will focus on APA style and the research report. So, when it comes to APA style, it's not the most exciting topic to teach and to learn about this for sure. So I'll try to keep this brief because I put a whole bunch of resources online in this folder for the week in terms of kind of making the process of understanding APA format a little bit easier. So I'll try to hit on the major points. And of course, you all have your APA manual. This is, again, the Bible for this class and writing APA papers going forward. So you'll always have that available along with a whole bunch of other resources. So when it comes to APA format, I guess we should talk a little bit about why it exists. Well, the cynical part of it is to make money. But the real part is that this is the publication format or style guidelines that are used by the American Psychological Association and a number of other organizations. APA format is actually pretty popular, and it's a way to standardize the writing so that we're all citing things in the same way, so it's easier for us to find sources when we need them. So in that way, it also helps to curb plagiarism because we should be able to find the sources that you're using, and APA format requires us to cite the sources that we are using. And it's a way to kind of just get us all on the same page in terms of being able to understand statistical results when they're presented, understanding the structure of an article, so we know where to look for something. If we're not going to read the entire article, we kind of have an idea of which section we should go to for the type of information that we're looking for. So it does serve a lot of useful purposes. Some of the rules in there might seem a little arbitrary, but they're there, and that's what we follow. So getting into some of the rules, starting with basic page formatting, we're going to use 1-inch margins all around. So if you don't already have 1-inch margins set in Word, you should go ahead and set all your margins to 1 inch. There's no specific or mandatory font that you have to use in APA style, but the traditional font is Times New Roman and at 12 points. So 12 point Times New Roman font in both the body and the header. So throughout the paper. Also throughout the paper, we want to double space everything. So everything is just double spaced. And we'll see, an example of this when I briefly go through an example template kind of document that I put together for APA formatting. So periods at the end of the sentence should be followed by 2 spaces. This is something that is still driving me crazy because it used to just be 1 space after a period, and my brain just cannot get over this. So I always have to go back and make sure I have 2 spaces between after a period. And in my emails too, forget all the typos and misspellings because I'm typing on my phone usually. But you'll see sometimes I have 1 space after a period, sometimes I have 2, because I'm trying to train my brain to get into that 2 spaces after a period. For indentation, so we indent paragraphs using the tab key, which should be set to 1/2 inch. So just your factory settings on Microsoft Word or most other word processing software will just be 1/2 inch. So 1 tab key for indentations, and we indent all paragraphs except for the abstract. We'll see that the abstract is not indented. And in the references, or the reference section, the way that we format references, we use what's known as a hanging indent. I know my little video box is cutting off that last part of that sentence there, but it's called the hanging indent, and we'll see what that looks like in a bit. So what are the sections that are involved in an APA research paper? We have our title page, and we're going to go through all of these sections individually, but we start off with the title page, followed by the abstract, so that's its own section, it gets its own page. Then we have the main body of the paper, and these main body is made up of different subsections that don't get their own page. The rest of the paper, the main body, is just flows. They're not on separate pages. So the main body includes the introduction, and we'll talk about what goes into the intro, the methods section, the results section, and the discussion section. And we'll talk about all of those in a moment. Then we have the references, and the reference section gets its own page with its own header on there. And then after the references, any appendices will be on separate pages as well. So if you wanted to include graphs or tables or figures, or even the materials that you use, if you used a survey and you wanted to include that as an appendix, that would be separate. That would be part of its own. That would be its own section, its own part of the paper. Okay, so the title page, what's on it? Well, the title for one, right? So we'll have the title of the paper, the author or author's name, or names, and their institutional affiliations. So we'll see an example of this in a minute. The title itself uses upper and lowercase, so don't make it all uppercase. It uses uppercase and lowercase letters, and it's centered, and in this newer edition it's bold-faced, so the title will appear in bold. The author's name should include their first name, middle initial if they have one, and their last name. So you don't use titles such as doctor or degrees. You don't need to list them. The first author, so who should come first? Who do you list first? That's going to be the primary author of the paper. And when we get to the next week, when we get to research ethics, we'll talk a little bit about how we determine who the primary author is. But typically it's the person who came up with the idea, or who put in the most work. Technically it's the person who did the most writing on the paper. The institutional affiliation should indicate the location where the authors conducted the research. So not necessarily where they are now, but where the research was conducted. You could always put in an author's note, which is what we see on the screen now. You could always put in the author's note if there was a change in affiliation. So if you collected this research as Sunio Oniana as an undergrad, but you're going to go to Albany or Binghamton or Harvard or something for graduate school, and you're writing up the paper, your affiliation would still be where the data was collected, Oniana, but you could have an author's note in there that you're now at Harvard as a grad student there. So the author's note should be divided up into several paragraphs. First, you want to include the author's name, the symbol for the ORCID ID, which we'll talk about, and the URL for that. And any authors who do not have an ORCID ID should be omitted from the author's note. they should definitely still be on the title page. They're still an author, but from this author's note section. Second, as I said, if you want to show any change in affiliation, or God forbid, any deaths of an author, should be noted here. Third, we want to include any disclosures or acknowledgments, such as study registration, if the study is registered with any type of organization or government agency, open practices and data sharing. So in this author's note, you might say contact the primary author for access to the data set. As researchers, we are not even encouraged, we're expected to share our data. Share our data set, our complete SPSS file. And you might be like, what? We have to give that away to anyone who wants it? Yep, pretty much. You have to give it away so that they can replicate your analyses to make sure we didn't mess up or cheat, right? So this should be noted in there, in the author's note. We also want to disclose any potential conflicts of interest. So if I'm doing a study on the effects of, effects of vitamin B on depression, and we find out vitamin B is wonderful for depression, and it turns out, well, some big vitamin B company, the one who paid for this study, we have to disclose that here in the author's note, right? Or that, hey, I got all this stock. I got a whole bunch of money in vitamin B supplement. That's something that we would need to disclose. And also any type of financial support or other assistance. So if you conducted this research because you got a grant, this is something that you would want to put in there, or because of somebody donated money to fund your study, this is something that you would put in the author's note as well. Finally, we want to include contact information for the corresponding author. I know my big head is cutting off that line again, but the corresponding author is usually the primary author or the first author, but not always. But this is the person who is basically gonna field any questions that anyone might have. So if people have questions about your research or your results or what have you, you need to include a way for them to get in touch with you. I have created a few scales that are open access. So basically, people all over the world use these scales. I did a short version of a gender role belief scale that every week I get 3 or 4 psychology students from India or Korea or Thailand or something asking for the scale or asking permission to use the scale. And I'm like, I put it in there. You can use the scale for free. You don't have to email me, but they do it as a courtesy. It's nice of them, but it's just more emails for me to read, right? Okay, so this is what a basic title page would look like. I'm just going to look at my larger screen up here because this looks really small on my laptop. So you can see, taking a look at this title screen, title page rather, the title is bold, it's centered, and it's using upper and lowercase letters. So we have a bit of a space there, and we have the author of the paper, in this case, Poly Purdue, and their affiliation, Department of English, Purdue University. This is something that we would see here because a professor's name is listed and a date is listed. This is a title page that we would see for a student research paper. So it looks like I put in the student research paper version of this rather than the professional version here. But your APA manual has guidelines as to what the professional title page version would look like. But when you submit papers in APA format, you would use a title page that looks like this. So your name would be here, your affiliation, Department of Psychology, Oneana, SUNY Oneana, the course name, my name, and the date that you completed it, or that when it was due, when you're submitting it. Moving on to the abstract. So the abstract, we said it is its own section, so it gets its own page. So we begin on a new page with the abstract, and this is where we first start seeing what's known as the page header. And the page header is basically just a shortened version of your title. We'll see an example of that in a minute here. But the page header goes in the header of the paper. And again, it's used as a way to kind of keep track of the article, or the title of the article, as we're reading through it. So the abstract, we said, gets its own page, includes a page header, and this is where we don't indent. It's basically the only time throughout an APA style paper that we're not indenting paragraphs. So it'll be left justified. And the abstract will be just a single paragraph, and it'll be no more than 250 words, and it should contain a brief description of your research topic, your research questions, the participants you used, the methods that you used, your main research findings, how you analyzed your data, and conclusions. And you're like, holy crap, how do I summarize? In some cases, these articles are 30 or 40 pages, right? How the hell do you summarize all of that in 250 words? It's not easy, that's for sure. As a general rule, what I tried to do is use one sentence as kind of like an intro. Another sentence is going to state my methods, like the participants that were used. The next one, my main methods. The next sentence, my main research findings. Another sentence for just wrapping it up. What are the major implications of this, and any limitations, kind of. But it's not easy. Writing abstracts takes a lot of work to get it down, for it to make sense, for it to be a good abstract, and to get it below 250 words. They used to be 150 words, which was damn near impossible. So it's a little bit easier now with the updated guidelines. Also, in the abstract, we can include keywords. So these are kind of the suggestions that we want PsycInfo or other databases to use when people are searching for our article. So we include these keywords, and we'll see that they go on a new line. We indent, and do tab, type keywords, and then we're going to list our keywords out. And we have an example of what that looks like here. So this is what an abstract page would look like. And you can see up here, when I was talking about the running head, it's a short version of your main title, and it's designed to basically capture what your paper is all about, but used as a header. And you can see that the running head is in all caps, and it's basically from this point forward going to appear on every page of your of the rest of your paper, right? Abstract is gets its own title, centered, bolded. We don't indent here, and this is about the size of an abstract. It's about as much space as you get, about as many words as you get to tell your reader what your study is all about. So definitely not an easy thing to do. And we see here some suggested keywords. how we do this, again, just indent, type out keywords, and then we can start listing the various keywords. Typically, you see people list about 5 or so keywords. That seems reasonable to do. Okay, moving on to the body of the paper. This is going to begin a new page, is where we're going to start with our introduction. And the purpose of the introduction is to establish your problem area. So what are you studying? This is your opportunity to kind of introduce us to your field, your idea, essentially, right? It's also the time for you to establish why your study is important. So not just what are you studying, but why are you studying this thing, right? Why is it important for us to know about this? Why should we care? Why should we keep on reading, essentially? Also, the introduction is where we provide a relevant literature review, and as we discussed last week, the literature review is an integral part of the research process. This is how we develop research hypotheses. So we have a research idea. That idea hopefully is going to lead to a question, and then we're going to go research that. We're going to research that question that we have. We're going to pour through tons and tons and tons of articles and previous research findings in order to come up with an answer to this research question, a testable answer, also known as a hypothesis, right? So what we're expecting to find. So we're going to present what we already know about this topic in terms of research findings. Then we're going to start introducing our perspective, or if not perspective, our contribution. So here's my research question. Here's what we already know about this, but we don't know this part, right? Or we don't know if these findings hold up under these circumstances. So this is basically what I'm doing differently. And this leads into the purpose of your study. Well, the purpose is this is where I'm coming from. I see a whole bunch of discrepancies here. I see a bunch of studies that contradict one another. So the purpose of this study is to try to bridge the gap between, say, some of this contradictory research using a brand new or innovative type of methodology or whatever it is that you might be doing, right? So this is where you want to explicitly state the questions that you're looking to explore, and then offer research hypotheses, right? So here it says offer a research hypothesis, and for your paper for this class, 1 is fine. Typically in studies we tend to have, well, minimum 1, but usually there are a couple of or a handful of research hypotheses that we want to explicitly state. Some of the guidelines. So again, we want to start by describing this problem area, then gradually start focusing on our specific hypotheses and purposes. So your part of the introduction, like where your study comes in, is towards the end. I would say right at the beginning you should start off with a pretty clear sentence or two about what your study is going to entail. What is it that you're looking at? What are you doing? But then the next, if it's a professional type of paper, like the next several pages are going to be reviewing other people's research. For your assignment, the next several paragraphs or the next page or two is going to be reviewing other people's research in there. And then you want to slowly bring it back to your study, right? So when we talk about the importance of the study, some of that stuff can come up front just to try to grab people's attention. Like, hey, look at this thing that I saw, and this is a problem, or this is really cool because yada yada yada, right? And here's everything other people have done, and then after all that, this is what I want to do, right? This is how I'm going to add to this. So somebody one day in a research methods class, when they search the literature, they're going to find my study here because it's really cool, and this is what I expect to find in here. So some, again, general guidelines in terms of writing up that introduction is that emphasis on what we already kind of know about the research topic or the research question that you're answering, because that's going to build the foundation for, well, why are you doing your study, right? Why do we need to hear this from you? Have other people done it before? And this is kind of your opportunity to say either, yeah, other people have done it before, but they kind of were really shitty in the way they approached it. Or, you know what, maybe you strike gold sometime and be like, nobody's ever really looked at this. So, this is a first, right? So this, again, shows why your study is kind of important. You want to emphasize results from prior research, not just the methodology. And it's rare that you even talk that much about the methods that other people use, unless it's only in passing. You would say so-and-so did a large-scale study involving this many participants, and they found ... We're really interested in the what did they find part. But giving a little bit of background and methodology can be important, because sometimes sample sizes are really small. Sometimes the samples themselves are just not good. They're biased samples. The way that the participants were assigned to groups might be problematic. So we mentioned methodologies in more detail when we notice problems in previous methodologies. Otherwise, we're going to focus more on the results of the studies, if they were good studies, right? We also want to recognize trends in literature. So trends in research. So we don't really know a whole lot about this, but it seems like from these handful of studies, it seems like this is what's going on. My study is going to offer concrete proof, or it's going to test it directly, right? That's kind of showing that you recognize the trends, you have an idea, a basis for your hypothesis, right? Because there's a trend here, so you have an idea of what to expect. But maybe you're the first study who actually is testing it directly. So that's your purpose, and that's the importance of your study as well. So again, use the introduction to point out gaps or inconsistencies in the literature. Show how your study differs from previous studies. We don't want to just be replicating other people's research. Even though if we did do more replications, our science would be a lot more reliable. Just replication studies don't get published very often. And unfortunately, academia, the scientific world, it's a publish or perish type of environment. Less so at a liberal arts college. It's kind of the reason why I didn't want to go to a research school. There's too much pressure pumping out all these studies, 3 or 4 of them a year. I'd much rather hang out with students. Okay, so point out flawed methodologies in previous research, as I said. Explain how your study will contribute to the scientific literature or help solve a problem if your study is more applied in nature. And one thing that we want to avoid almost at all costs is to use direct quotations. We almost never want to have anything in quotation marks taken from directly from the articles that we are reviewing. Instead, we want to put them into our own words and cite them, give them credit appropriately. So after the introduction, we get into the methods section. And the purpose of the methods section is to outline the physical steps that we took in order to gather our data. So we're basically describing the who or what was studied, and how they were studied, essentially. So the who or what we're referring to are participants. For us, right? We're dealing with human subjects, so we're dealing with people. So we want to describe who made up our sample, who was in our sample, what was the breakdown by, let's say, gender or race or slash ethnicity, what was the average age, so on and so forth. So whatever demographic information that would be important to show that you had a representative sample, or at least a diverse type of sample. Also, the methods section is where we provide our operational definitions. So we tell people exactly, or tell our audience, whoever's reading our article, exactly how we defined certain variables, exactly how we manipulated certain variables, and exactly how we measured certain variables. So all of those are operational definitions, right? So this is where we describe them. We also describe what type of instrumentation was used, and that could be lab instrumentation, or it could be, what kind of surveys that were given out, or any other type of equipment that might have been used in the study. If you were measuring somebody's heart rate, you're going to have to describe what monitor did you use, what version was it, who manufactured it, right? Where can we find it? If I want to replicate your study, I need to use the same equipment that you used, and I'm going to need to use the same operational definitions that you use, and I'm going to need to maybe not have the same exact participants, but I want to have a similar sample that you use, right? And also, this last part here, report any other procedures that were followed. I want to make sure that I'm following your study, your methods, your procedures step by step, right? So you need to lay out exactly what happened during this experiment in enough detail that I can replicate it. Okay, so there are usually several subsections to the methods section. So some of the most common would be participants subsection, materials subsection, and procedures subsection. But depending on, the nature of your study and what kind of article you're writing it up, if you have a lot of journals give page limits, so if you have 30 pages, you might have a bunch more subsections in there. If you have 12-page limit, you might be trying to crunch condense some of this stuff to save room. So when it comes to that participants subsection, we want to describe our participants in detail. Like I said, describe the average age and maybe even age range. So from the youngest participant to the oldest participant, a breakdown by gender, by race, or ethnicity, education level, if sexual orientation is important for the study, break it down that way. So break it down basically in any way that is going to, again, show that you have a diverse representative sample, and if you need to add in some other type of socio-demographic information there that's particularly related or important to your study, there's the place to do it. You also want to describe how did you get these people to participate in your study. So did you pay them? Were they volunteers? Were they college students that got course credit? How'd you get them to agree? And also, you have to describe that they went through informed consent. And this is usually where we put in also that our study was approved by our institutional review board. That's a term that will come up in our next chapter, but essentially it's the ethics board that oversees how we treat human participants in research. So we want to make sure that we say that participants provided informed consent. We could also name the population and the sampling methods that were used. Typically, this would only happen if we were using true random sampling. If we're talking about the population and sampling methods used, if we were using true random sampling, we would determine or describe how the hell did you find everyone in your population, and then how did you randomly pick them out. Most of the time we use convenience samples, meaning that we don't have a truly randomized process of picking our participants. So we still want to describe, though, how we recruited our participants. So did we put ads in the paper? Did we put ads on Facebook? Did we ask people to share the research information with their friends? Did we look for volunteers at the hospital or at the county court room? Whatever the case may be, we kind of have to describe how did these people make it into our sample, right? So if this part here describes how we got them to participate, this here states that we have to describe also how did we find them to begin with, right? Before we could even ask them to participate. Also, we have to report the number of people who dropped out of the study and for what reasons, right? So if people dropped out because if you're doing a study, particularly on, say, an experimental drug for stage 4 cancer or something, and people will most likely die, especially those in the placebo group, but maybe in the treatment group as well, if your treatment isn't having any effect. So you need to report that those people dropped out of the study because they died, right? Or some other people might drop out of a study because they move or because they just no longer wanted to participate, right? When it comes to procedures, what goes into the procedures? Well, the experimental procedures should be described in enough detail, like I said before, so that your study could be replicated by anybody who's reading your paper. So this is actually a good time to kind of hand it over to a friend. Well, the whole paper, you should always have a friend or two to go through your paper and ask you questions, because if people don't understand something that's in your study, it's your fault. It's not their fault, right? It means you need to make things clearer. So if people ask you, well, how exactly did you do this in that study? Well, ding, ding, ding. That means you should probably add that. You should probably add that to the procedures, right? So if some of your more science-inclined friends, or even just people who, the procedures, your whole study ideally should be written in a way that a person who doesn't have to be a rocket scientist to understand the basics of what you did, right? We try to write our research findings in a way that are at least digestible for most people, right? Most people who they might not understand all like the stat symbols and terms that we're using, but reading the study, they should have a general idea of what you did, why you did it, how did you do it, what did you find, and why should we care, kind of, right? But procedures, make sure they're written in enough detail that I could replicate your study if I wanted to. When it comes to the results section, sole purpose is to report the results of the study. So we're not going to start trying to interpret anything at this point. We're not trying to start talking about implications or anything like that. Really, this is kind of just where we report the straight up statistical analyses that we used. So we ran a t-test, and these are the means and standard deviations we found between the groups, and it was or was not significantly different, and report our the results of our t-test in correct APA format. So the results section can get kind of repetitive because it's really just listing the test you use, the descriptive stats, and the results of the inferential stats, essentially. Right? So we're not getting into analyzing anything yet. This is straight up stats. So it could get boring to read, definitely could get boring to write. Luckily, it's pretty easy to write. It kind of plugging and chugging. There's not a whole lot of creativity involved in reporting your results. We're going to save that for the discussion there. So in terms of guidelines, we want to present descriptive statistics first. So if you remember, descriptive stats are our means, our standard deviations, frequencies. We want to describe how we analyze the data, and this can involve saying that we used Excel, or we used SPSS, or we used R, or we used Amos, whatever statistical program that you use. Or you can be brave and say we did it by hand. We calculated these numbers by hand. I'm sure you said that you had a bunch of people double and triple, quadruple check those numbers. But talk about how you analyze the data. Did you recode things? Did you take a continuous variable and turn it into an ordinal variable to make groups? Describe what you did to the data, and then tell us what actual statistical tests that you used, right? So again, I'm blocking this over here, but it says name the statistical methods that you used, but you don't actually have to show us formulas or calculations or anything. You could just say we ran a one-way ANOVA with Bonferroni post-hoc analyses. That's fine. Then go ahead and tell us what you found after that, right? So just some basic guidelines here. Statistical figures. So all these statistical symbols should be underlined or italicized. They're pretty much always just italicized now. Underlined used to be when, some people were still using word processors. That was not that long ago, so we can laugh now. And you might say, what the hell is a word processor? It's kind of like an electric typewriter, and some of you might say, what the hell is a typewriter? But that's, believe it or not, when I first started college, I wrote papers on word processor. So not that long ago. I'm not that old. When it comes to statistical figures, they should really be italicized at this point. We want to spell out numbers that are less than 1. No, less than 10. That should be. So that's a typo in there. So any numbers that are less than 10, we would spell out. So if we were reporting 2 in the results section, if we said 2, we ran 2 t-tests, we would say TWO, not the numerical number or symbol of 2 in there. But for numbers 10 and above, then we actually just we just present the number itself, the symbol. The results section is not a place where we want to start including graphs or tables or charts or any of this stuff. Remember, we save those for the end of the paper, and those will be appendices to the paper. So the discussion section, what's this about? Well, the purpose is to interpret our results. So this is where we get to actually talk about all the stuff that we just wrote up in the results section. So don't do any analyses and don't do any interpretations or anything in that results section. We save that for the discussion section here. So we're going to interpret our results. Another purpose is to explain how our findings relate to previous research. So how do our results match up with all those studies we were talking about in our literature review? Did we find similar results? Did we find different results? Why? What if we found different results? What might be some explanation for them? We also want to express any limitations of our study. Every study is going to have limitations. There's no way you're going to be able to cover everything in one single study, nor should you even try to. Science builds off of each other. Each scientific finding builds off of previous ones, and it's been working just fine that way, because when you build off and you take things slowly and methodically, you're kind of validating previous research sometimes, right? Sometimes you're contradicting it, but each new little type of study is kind of just adding more and more evidence to this theory, or to this phenomenon, or understanding of this phenomenon. So a good way to come up with suggestions for future research is to basically say, we should do all those things that our study didn't do. So discussing limitations are actually a good way to come up with ideas for future research, and you're gonna have them. Usually at the end of your study, mostly when you're doing your results, your analysis for your results, you're like, damn, we should have included this. Well, why didn't we do this in our study? Because then it could explain this weird finding that we have. So I say, don't worry about it. That's another study. The next time, just do the study again. Next time, include that, right? So when we talk about future directions or suggestions for future research, it actually tends to be a lot easier than you think. There's going to be a whole bunch of stuff you wish you did differently, and those could all just, instead of being regrets, they can become the opportunity for new research, right? So guidelines, we want to again just make sure that we're referring back to our hypotheses. Did we support them or not? Right? Do the results support our hypotheses, or fail to support them? We also want to mention again what the purpose of our paper was. So in the discussion section, did we fulfill our purpose? Did we fail to fulfill our purpose, right? And again, just as a reminder, sometimes people will skip all of your paper and go directly to the discussion just to figure out what you find and what needs to be done. So it's good to make sure you throw your purpose in there again. So as we're reading the interpretations of your findings and explaining hearing you explain your limitations, it's good to keep in the back of our head, remembering what the purpose of your study was, or questions that you had posed in the introduction. So remind us, what did you plan out to do, and did you do that? What did you plan out to find? Did you find that or no? Right? So let us know. So that looks like it's the first one there is on there twice. So again, just to reiterate, point out how your results are consistent or inconsistent with results from the literature that you reviewed in your intro. So you finding what other people found, or are your results contradictory? Interpret your results and offer explanations for why you found what you did. Now, offer explanations, but this is where you want to be humble explanations, right? Because you don't really know exactly why you found the results that you did. You have an idea, clearly, right? Because at this point, you're almost mean, you are the expert on your own study, so you should have some kind of idea, but this is the time to be modest. You don't want to come up and say, well, we found these results because ... Someone else is sure enough going to come along and say, nope, that's not why you found these results. You don't know what the hell you're talking about, right? So just be modest, offer humble, modest explanations. It's always good to use words like possibly, or this may be explained by, or future research might show, or things like that. You don't want to be too arrogant in this field. In research in general, somebody's gonna come and burn you, and it's not like getting owned on the internet. This is getting owned in real life, and getting owned in real life hurts more than getting owned on the internet, right? So again, state the implications of your study. So what are your of your findings? So what do your findings mean for this area of research? Or if you're doing an applied study, what do the implications mean for a real world problem that we might have, right? So why should we care? Like, what does this mean? Okay, you found all of this stuff. Now what? What are we going to do with it, kind of, right? Here's not the place to start introducing new data or new hypotheses or new research questions, and certainly not a place for you to start dipping back into the literature. On very, very rare occasions, but let's just keep that as a rule, that you don't want to start introducing new references. Sometimes we'll do that in order to try to explain some of our research findings that we weren't expecting. So you might see, people say, well, we found this and that was kind of unexpected, but this one study actually found something similar related to a different field, but maybe something like that's going on in our study too. But let's just say for our sake right now, don't start including new references. Just kind of go back to the references that you used in your literature search or your lit review. And as we said before, multiple times now, offer specific recommendations for future research. What would you do differently, right? So some other guidelines in terms of APA style in general. So we always use the present tense when we're writing research proposals. So for this class, you'll be writing a research proposal, and you'll be using present tense. So, or future tense even. You'll be talking about what you will be doing. For research that's already been done, already been completed, we would use the past tense. So past tense for reports of research that have already been done. Here we go. Spell out numbers less than 10, not less than 1. So example, we would spell out 9, not write the number 9. Use digits for numbers greater than 10, except when we're starting a sentence. So this is an example of one of those I before E except after C type of rules that you find in APA guidelines here and there. So when we're starting a sentence, we will always spell out the number, even if it's a big one. If it's beginning a sentence, it gets spelled out. We want to avoid slang, profanity, or cliches, or proverbs, or anything like that. We're trying to be, very clear and concise in our writing. So, slang words, unless you're doing a paper on slang in communication or languages or on proverbs or whatever. Otherwise, we want to kind of leave them out. We're not trying to be artsy or cutesy or anything in our research reports. We're really just trying to report our findings. And not only can this stuff get annoying, but it can get confusing, right? Some proverbs mean different things to different people. And we also want to use the active voice. So the active voice rather than passive voice. So we would say that we conducted the research and not that the research was conducted by us. So we always want to use the passive, active voice, right? Okay. When it comes to the reference section, the reference section gets its own section, starts on its own new page, and we'll see that there are a number of different ways that you cite something or list your reference depending on what type of article or book, or depending on what type of reference it is. But the purpose of the reference section is to list the publications, the resources essentially, that you used in your paper, and to give appropriate credit to the authors of those publications, and to provide a way for the reader to find these publications on their own. Again, we don't ever want the reader to just trust us on something. Our research reports should be chock full of evidence, and says if people take issue with our lit review, be like, hey dude, here's the references, here are the references I use, go look it up yourself. If you come to a different conclusion, then so be it, but this is what I came up with, and I ain't faking it. There's the references, go check them out yourself, right? So just again, basic guidelines for the reference section. Begins on a new page, starts with the title at the top that says references, and we use the title is centered and bolded, and we use one double space below the header, and we'll see that we just use double space throughout the entire paper here. So we want to provide the appropriate citation for every single reference that you use in your paper. Don't leave any out, or that's technically plagiarism. All entries again should be double spaced, and we use a hanging indent for all entries. So what does that mean? Well, it means that this first line of your reference is actually justified, left justified, and we indent every other line that comes after it. So this would be an example here of a hanging indent, right? So we are going to list our entries in alphabetical order by the first author's last name, and as I said, different sources are cited differently, and that's where the APA manual comes into play. And this is where some of those resources I put online will be helpful as well. So make sure you have appropriate in-text citation for each of your references. So anytime you use an article or talk about somebody else's work in your literature review or discussion section, even anytime you're talking about someone else's work, you need to give them appropriate in-text citation. So how do we do that? Well, there are a couple of ways that we can do it. Let me just skip ahead and show you some of the basics here for in-text citations. One way that you can do an in-text citation is say something like, researchers have found that blah 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 blah, and then in parentheses, Jones, the last name of the first author, ampersand Smith, the name of the second author, comma, and the year it was published. So what does this allow me to do? Well, let's see what all three of these let me do. The second way that we can do an in-text citation is say Jones and Smith, and then put the year in parentheses, found that ... Or I could say in 2002 Jones and Smith found ... So these are the three typical ways that we give credit to people when we're talking about their research. Try to mix them up just so we don't sound repetitious in there, but all three of these things are providing me with some important and basic information, right? I know I could go to your reference section. If you said Jones and Smith said this thing, and I'm like, I don't know, might have to call BS on that. Well, I could go to your reference section and I can scroll down because they're all listed in alphabetical order by the first author's last name. So I could just go to Jones and take a look at the year 2002, and then you're going to tell me what journal this was from, what the title of the article, what pages I could find it on, so I could go find this article myself and read it to make sure that what you're saying is true, right? And all three of these things allow me to do that. Okay, I know I need to look for Jones 2002 in the reference section. Okay, 2002, Jones. I know I need to look for that in the reference section. Okay, so make sure, again, when you're reviewing literature, people's work, that you're giving credit to them, because plagiarism is kind of a big deal, right? So when should we use and or this ampersand? So when part of the sentence we tend to use and, so we would say Jones and Smith. So that's part of a sentence there. But inside parentheses, we will use the ampersand. So, example, a recent study, Jones, ampersand, Smith. So this is when we know when we should use and versus the ampersand. What happens when we have multiple authors for these in-text citations? Well, one author is pretty easy. Just the last name, right? Say Henriquez 2004. Have two people, that's pretty easy too. We've already seen a couple examples there. We would say Brown and Henriquez 2004. 3 to 5, we would, the first time we have 3 to 5, the first one would be the first author. So Miller, comma, second, the last name of the second author. So Miller, Bosong, Smith, and Bala, 2003. And then for all the citations that come after that, we would just say Miller et al., 2003, right? But the first time, from 3 to 5 authors there, you gotta spell out all their last names. Now, sometimes you might have 6 or more authors on a paper, particularly if it's a medical paper. They tend to have like dozen plus authors sometimes. So 6 or more, we will always just cite the first author and et al. In the reference section, you're going to have to list out every single author. But for in-text citations, it'll just be Miller et al., even for the first time. When it comes to citing organizations, so again, if you wanted to cite the APA manual for some reason, you would say the American Psychological Association the first time that you're using it, right? So the first time you're going to use this organization name, spell it out, and then in parentheses put the acronym. And then for all the citations that come after that first one, you could just use the acronym APA. Secondary sources. So when we are talking about research that other people are citing, so these are not articles that we have in front of us, but I have an article in front of me that mentions someone else's article, right? That's tricky. We tend to try to discourage this. Why? Well, because you're relying on the person in front of you to have gotten this other person's research right. And it's really best for you to go directly to the source, that primary source, and find it yourself. Sometimes it's impossible. It is, right? And sometimes people will have direct quotes that come from the other people. So secondary sources are going to be derived from primary sources, from the sources that we have available, often by someone other than the original author. So let's say I have Jones's 2003 article right in front of me, and Jones is quoting Dr. Lydia Santana. I want to really use this, and I can't find Dr. Santana's article. What can I do? Well, again, not ideal, but this is how you're going to cite it if you're going to use it. We would say, Dr. Lydia Santana or Lydia Santana. We typically don't use titles when we're referring to researchers or research. And a lot of times we don't even use first names. We just say Brown, 2003, Brown, blah, 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 right? But we would say Santana or Lydia Santana as cited in the article I have in front of me, Jones, 2003. So Lydia Santana as cited in Jones, 2003, outlined the procedures of blah, blah, blah. Or Lydia Santana has cited in Jones, 2003, described the results of her research as blah, 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 right? When we have multiple citations, so this means like sometimes we want to make a point about something, and we want to back it up with more than just one article, right? So if we wanted to make a broad statement that says, if we want to say that research has shown that men on average tend to be more physically aggressive than women, we might not just want to put one citation there, because that's a really general, sweeping statement that you're saying about half of the population here. So we might want to actually put a few studies in there, maybe a few big type of studies in there, to kind of really hammer home our point and to say, look, I'm not being sexist or anything. This is just what the research shows, and it's not just one study. It's a whole bunch of studies, right? So let's say we were to do that. We were to make a statement about like male aggression. We might want to put in several sources there. How we would do that? Well, we would do it the same way that we would cite the sources initially, but we would just separate them using a semicolon. So we see Howard and Dean, 2004, semicolon, Grosscup, comma, Brown, comma, and so Grosscup, Brown, and Bala, 2003, Carey and Edwards, 2004, right? So you could have multiple citations for the same piece of information that you're citing. We're almost there. We're almost done. I know this is a very fun lecture here. So here's just an example of what references are going to look like. These are for journal articles. Now, if you cite books, there's a whole different way of how you're going to cite a book. If you cite a newspaper, if you cite a website, but all of that stuff is going to be found in this manual. It's going to also be found on some of the resources and handouts that I posted on Blackboard for you. But just generally, let's go through one of these here. This is the last name of the first author. So Finn, this is their initial of their first name. So it doesn't look like they have a middle initial or a middle name in here. So Finn, comma, J, period, comma, ampersand. This is the last name of the second author, separated by comma, with their middle initial, period, comma, the year that the article was published, the title of the article, and you can see it's only the first word that gets capitalized here, except that we have a We have a colon here, so anything after a colon gets capitalized, we know as well. But it's just lowercase for everything else. So victimization online, colon, the downside of seeking human services for women on the internet. Then we have the name of the journal. So in this case, the journal is called Cyber Psychology and Behavior, and that gets italicized. So the name of the journal will be italicized, and this is the volume number, so it'll be volume 3, and that gets italicized as well. Right next to that, in parentheses here, is the issue number. So in this case, this is volume 3, issue number 6. So that does not get italicized. That's just in parentheses. Then we have a comma, and these are our page numbers. And that's it, right? And we can take a look at another one down here. The last name of the first author, followed by their initials. First name, middle name, initial. Second author, first name, initial, middle name, initial. Lopez, first name, initial, middle name, initial. The year that it was published. Sexual harassment in the workplace, exploring the effects of attractiveness on perception of harassment. And we see that this was published in the journal Sex Roles, and that gets italicized. And that was in, why is this word escaping me? I just said it, I'm having a brain fart. That's the issue. What the hell is, I'm totally having a brain fart. I'm having a brain fart here. It'll come back to me. I just freaking said the word, though it's escaping me. So the issue number doesn't get italicized, and we have our page number here. And I have to be done because I am drawing a blank. I'm drawing a blank here. So I already said it. I can't think of the word. I start to freak out now, panicking a bit. Just rewind a bit. I said it right up here. Why can't the word's escaping me? Moral of the story: read the APA manual, and definitely, if not read it, refer to the APA manual, and then, of course, refer to the different resources that I put online. I'm going to make another short video, short tutorial, just going through those different resources and going through a sample APA paper. So look for that coming up. Okay, I'll see you in a bit.